Amen. Thank you, Brother Sam. Can you hear? Is that all right? Is that working, Matt? Yep. Excellent. Alrighty. So this afternoon, the Spirit must be moving because you guys are about to get a double dose of Samson today. So I think everybody else was aware that I was preaching on Samson except for Brother Sam. And there's obviously a reason for that. The Lord obviously wants us to learn some lessons from this part of the Bible, clearly. And the title of my sermon this afternoon is A Flawed Hero. A Flawed Hero. Now, we've just read from Numbers chapter 6, which is all about the Nazirite vow. Now, the Nazirites, it was a special vow in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, that someone could take. It was available to anybody that wanted to take the vow. And the idea of the vow was specifically for a special period of separation unto the Lord. And in that vow, there were certain rituals that you had to perform, or just certain things that you couldn't do. And one of them was cut your hair. Another was you couldn't eat or drink of the vine at all. No alcohol, no eating grapes. You also couldn't eat any nuts. So there was just a few specific things. And I think the reason for this is it was just so that somebody taking that vow could be distinct amongst God's people while they were taking that vow. And usually it wasn't a lifelong vow. It was just for a set period of time, a certain number of days that they'd take the vow. And then when the vow was over and finished, there were certain rituals and part of the ceremony that finalised the end of that vow, so to speak. Now, in the New Testament, we don't take special vows or a Nazirite vow to God, but there's certainly some principles that we can take from the Nazirite vow. And what I'd like to look at, like in Romans 12, verse 1, it reads, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. So for us as believers in the New Testament, we don't do a Nazirite vow, right? We don't let our hair grow down to our waist, right? We're commanded to actually have short hair in the New Testament. But I just want to point out here that in the New Testament, when we're commanded to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy means separate or apart, and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. That's our reasonable service. That's what we're expected to do as believers in the New Testament. We're not doing anything special or above and beyond by presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice, living holy lives. That's like the bare minimum expectation that the Lord has of us in the New Testament. And here we see in the Old Testament this special vow where they'd dedicate themselves to the Lord and be separate unto the Lord. Well, for us, that's a daily thing as believers in the New Testament. It's not a special vow that we take. It's something that we do daily as believers. Now, in Samson's case, what we're going to read, if we turn to Judges chapter 13, in the case of Samson, his vow was a lifelong vow. And he didn't personally make this vow. It was made on the behalf of his parents who raised him, because in Judges chapter 13, verse 1, it reads, And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman, and said unto her, Behold now, thou art barren, and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive and bear a son. Now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing, for lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite unto God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Then the woman came and told her husband, saying, A man of God came unto me, and his countenance was like the countenance of an angel of God, very terrible. But I asked him not whence he was, neither told me his name. But he said unto me, Behold, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and now drink no wine nor strong drink, neither eat any unclean thing, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death. So even his mother had to abide by certain things while she was carrying Samson in her womb. So this was from not just from birth, but this is from conception right through to the end of his life. He was a Nazirite, biblically. That's what the Bible's teaching here. So he's a special child, right? Now we might look at Samson and you could think that he's special and God's got a special plan for Samson and it's just for him and, who am I? I'm just one believer amongst millions of believers on planet Earth. Does God have a special plan for me? Is there anything significant about me? Well, here's the thing. It's for each of us as believers in the New Testament, it's up to the individual. Like, I promise you, the Lord has big plans for your life. Everyone here he has big plans for everyone here. But it's up to us whether we choose to walk in the Spirit and do great works for God, or whether we just live in the flesh and don't do a great deal for God. Because God's got these plans for us. They're big plans. And on the Sunshine Coast, there's a lot of lost people on the Sunshine Coast where we live right now. There's a lot of people that are heading to hell. And it's our responsibility to do a great work in our local area. Now, for some of us might end up travelling to other places, other parts of the country, even internationally. I know Sam's done some missionary work overseas. So some of us might end up doing those sorts of things. But you don't have to go to a distant land to do great works for the Lord. And I promise you, God does have special plans for you. And in fact, in Ephesians 2 verse, if you just quickly turn there, Ephesians 2 verse 10. Ephesians chapter 2. Now we're all very familiar with verses 8 and 9. The teaches salvation is by grace through faith. But in verse 10 it reads, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them." The Lord has already ordained the works for you to walk in them. And we're going to see in Samson's life that God had this big work for him. His mission was to destroy the Philistines. That was his mission. Now, we're not, in the New Testament, we're not commanded to go out and kill and slay people, right? But we are commanded to do great works for God. And sometimes these great works, they're as simple as sometimes just knocking on someone's door and just giving them the gospel. That is a great work. And when you multiply that over and over and you're consistent and you're doing it week in, week out, you are doing a great work for God. Now, concerning Samson's upbringing, what I want to touch on here, the first point I guess I want to make is holiness is our reasonable service. Right? That's my first point. That's just our reasonable service to live holy, separate lives unto God. Point number one. But next, what I want to look at is how we raise how we are, how we ought to be, and also how we raise our children. Because in Samson's case, he was obviously raised in this situation where he's got this dedication as a Nazirite, a special vow, which his parents had to be careful that he maintained and kept from his youth up until he became of age where he could start making his own decisions. We're going to see Samson make some poor decisions, but also at the end we're also going to see with Samson, because I want to have a positive look at Samson in this sermon, is at the end of his life, I believe he remained a faithful man to the Lord. And we're going to see that right up to his death, that he remained faithful to the end. But in regards to our children, Jason touched on this verse in his sermon last week in Ephesians 6 verse 4. "And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." And if you want your children to do great works for God, this is what we ought to be doing. We ought to be bringing them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And I want to mention this. I really appreciate what Sam and Eve do for two of my children. Sam's fantastic. If you don't know, Brodie's actually working a couple of days a week with Sam at the moment. And it's a blessing. It's a blessing to have my son working with someone like Sam, where he's got a good introduction into the workforce with some good influence, and it's a good way of easing him into that workplace environment. I imagine it's challenging enough in the workplace without having, with having somebody as a believer that's your boss, but going into the workforce, being around somebody that's not a believer as a boss, it would be super, super challenging and hard, especially for a young man like Brodie, a young child. And so I'm really appreciative of that. But that's all part of the family that we are here at the church, how we help one another, we nurture, and we admonish our children in the Lord, in their upbringing. You can't have too many positive influences around your children. And that's what I really appreciate. And Eve is also helping Paris out with, I think, her English. Is it English lessons? Sort of? English lessons. I think you're going to do some music as well. So that's exciting. Like, that's just super encouraging to have people in the church that are prepared to just help out like that. And I love it. It's great for the kids. Also in 1 Peter 2:9, as far as the separation goes, 1 Peter 2 verse 9, it says, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people." So this isn't just for special individuals that take some special vow. This is applicable to all of us in the New Testament, that we are a peculiar people. That means we stand out. Now here's the thing, someone like Samson taking the Nazirite vow, he stands out. He's somebody that would be peculiar to most of the people around him because of his long hair, can't have anything of the vine, there's certain restrictions, can't eat nuts, etc. There's certain things he can't do, but he also would have looked very different as a man with long hair because everybody else would have had short hair, right? And the idea there is obviously so he's distinct and sticks out, right? We should be the same. We should be a peculiar people. We should be a people that really stand out in the world, in the workplace, wherever we be. 1 Peter 1:14, "As obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy." Now, you can't be any holier than God, right? God is holiness. He represents separation, from the world. He's perfect and holy. But the Bible commands us to be holy as he is holy. Be separate as he is separate. Now here's the thing. Samson would have known all about separation from a young age because of his vow that he'd taken. Well, that was sort of pretty much forced upon him, really. But his parents, on behalf of the Lord, he's taken this vow. He was all too familiar with separation. And you could probably try and imagine if you were someone like Samson with that vow from a young age all the way through, as you're growing into a man, you've got long hair. You can't cut your hair. And you've probably got all these men around you with short hair that actually look more like men, but you've actually got to keep growing your hair. So he would have felt that separation. Well, absolutely. Like, it would have been so different for him growing up. Now, if we go to Judges chapter 14, so turn over to Judges 14. Now, Samson's now at an age where he's looking for a wife. And in Judges chapter 14, "And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife." Kind of sounds demanding, doesn't it? Go fetch me a wife. Then his father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren or among all my people that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. But his father and mother knew not that it was of the Lord that he sought an occasion against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So something here is, Samson, we know, as believers, we ought not to be yoked with unbelievers, right? And his parents, they knew about the vow, clearly. They knew Samson had to be a Nazirite. Obviously what they weren't aware of was his mission was to absolutely destroy the Philistines. This was his mission. And what you'll notice here, his parents are trying to do the right thing. They want him to marry within, the Israelites, one of their own, so to speak. But Samson had other plans. And look, this is a little bit controversial. I've heard both sides preached on this particular passage here. Samson's in sin doing what he's doing, and others, look, it's of the Lord, so no, this was part of the plan, he had to do this. Regardless of what your take is on this, my personal opinion is I think Samson, it's just part of his mission. And I think he deliberately chooses a Philistine woman for this very reason. And you could say he's disobeying his parents. Well, he is. But, I firmly believe this was just part of the mission that he had and that God had called him to do. And I honestly believe he could have easily picked a wife amongst the Israelites, but that wasn't the plan. And you'll see this unfold. Because he does take a Philistine wife, the events that then unfold, to me, nothing short of amazing, what takes place, and Samson, what he does with his faith in God. But as a reminder for children, here's my recommendation. If you don't want a rough, if you want to have a rough life, marry an unbeliever. If you're not married today, you're single and you're looking for a wife, if you want the roughest life possible, marry an unbeliever. And you're going to see in Samson's life, he has a rough life. But that was part of the plan, that was part of his mission. Now, in the New Testament, I don't believe we're called to do anything remotely like this. And that's why I would firmly recommend and just marry a believer. Your life will be much easier for it. Look, marriage is challenging enough when you're married to a believer, let alone an unbeliever. Because at least as believers, you have that in common. Even if there might not be much other common ground, having that in common is just so important. It's critical. And, I've seen firsthand with my own parents the troubles that they've gone through, and it's just not worth it. And I'll read from 2 Corinthians 6 verse 1, Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness, and what concord hath Christ with Belial, or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel, and what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God, as God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Because the thing about marriage, it's final. Once you make that decision, there's no turning back. And, a word of warning is if in your mind you become prideful and sort of think, I'll convert them, I'll win them over, I'll change their mind, they'll change their mind, they'll love me enough that I'll be able to convince them, they'll get saved. Don't fool yourself. That's all I'll say. Don't fool yourself. That may happen. You may be fortunate, but you may not. So don't make that mistake. So point 2, do not be yoked with unbelievers. Continuing on in Judges 14, so here we see Samson's first real sort of major victory here in Judges 14 verse 5. Then went Samson down and his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, and he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his father or his mother what he had done. This is incredible, right? Young man, with his bare hands, tears apart a young lion. Now it says here that the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, so we know it wasn't by his own strength that he tore this lion in two. It was through the power of God. And what I notice about Samson here, and I think this gives us a little bit of insight into his character a bit. Me, if I was a young man and I tore a lion in two, I'd be bragging, I'd be talking to everybody about what I'd done, right? That's me. That's me being in the flesh, right? But there'd be that strong temptation to tell everyone what you'd done, right? Like if you tore a lion in two and you've got the body there to prove it, I'd be telling people, look at me, right? Samson doesn't do that. In fact, he doesn't even tell his mum and dad. I think that gives us a little bit of insight into his character. I don't think he's the kind of person that really sort of took confidence in that power. He knew it was of the Lord. He didn't really want to brag and talk about it. I mean, if we're going to boast, we boast in the Lord. He could have done that. He could have gone to his parents and told them, hey, look, the Lord gave me this amazing power. He doesn't even do that. So they're not even aware of what he's done here. Now, I think that gives you a bit of insight into Samson's character. So I really don't think he's somebody that, took pride in his power that he had. And for all we know, he could have been a skinny guy. Like he might not have actually been that muscly, because it's by the Spirit of the Lord that he does this, right? It's not by his own strength. And and here's another thing, I don't think it's a coincidence that his first major battle or victory here is over a lion, specifically a lion. And in 1 Peter 5, chapter 5, verse 8, the Bible reads, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour, whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world." And to me, it's no surprise, because when we read about Jesus in Matthew chapter 4, shortly after he's baptized by John, he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights, goes into the wilderness, and he's tempted by the devil. It's the first thing that happens after he's baptized. And I think for all believers, I think it's part of the process. It's what happens. After we're saved, I do believe that all of us have that moment where the devil comes to us and tries to draw us away from the Lord. And it happens early on. And look, I can share from personal experience. I've been saved now, I think around about 7 years. I think it's about 7 years I've been saved. And early on, like shortly after I believed the gospel and I was saved, I had an encounter. It's amazing what happened to me. I mean, I knew of there was 4 individuals that I was sort of close to, that I was spending time with, and I thought 3 of them were saved. You know, maybe they are, God knows. But I just want to share a personal experience as a young believer with sort of what I went through. Because shortly after I was saved, of course, naturally, I want everyone that I know to be saved, right? Like, I was just full of joy. I was like so relieved, massive weight off my shoulders. I wanted to share the gospel with everyone. And so I start contacting all my old friends and people that I know. And lo and behold, one of my friends, so he was the best man at my wedding, he makes an effort to come up to Queensland. He drives up to Queensland and he has a car crash in Goondiwindi. And he calls me at like 2 a.m. in the morning, "Callum, I need you to come and get me. I'm in Goondiwindi, I've had a crash, I'm in a bad way, blah, blah." So I left at like 3 in the morning and drove down to Goondiwindi, picked him up, took him home. And of course, my intention is, this is the best man at my wedding, this is a good mate of mine, I'm going to get him saved, I'm going to give him the gospel, right? Little did I know at the time that, you know, it later became apparent that this guy, he's a reprobate. Now, I didn't know this. This was a hard lesson for me early on, and I didn't know about the doctrine of reprobates at the time. I had no idea. My intention and my idea was right, in the sense I just wanted to give him the gospel and get him saved. But even though we took him in, took care of him, helped him, you know, I'm spending time with him in the scriptures, trying to get it, because he's from my old church. He believes a false gospel. And he couldn't have been a worse guest in my house, if I'm just to be perfectly frank with you. And I was so frustrated as a young believer. I'm full of joy, I'm full of zeal, and this could have been something that really just put the fire out, you know. And this is what I believe the devil does when we're young believers. He comes at us early, he comes hard, and he tries to rattle us, he just tries to get us off track. There were some other individuals that were listening to the same preaching online from Stephen Anderson and Roger Jimenez at the time, because we were listening to a lot of these sermons. We didn't have a church here. There was no church. There was no decent church for me to go to. So we were listening to a lot of sermons online, and I thought these guys were my mates. You know, these are believers. They're like-minded, like me. And over the course of time, over the course of like 6 months, it became apparent that these people were not like-minded at all. And it actually got to the point where they became just super critical of everything that I believed and some of the doctrines that I held. But this is what the devil does. He will try his best to absolutely rattle you early on in your walk, and also even later on in your walk. If you have a moment of weakness, the devil's waiting to prey on that. He'll try and take advantage of any sort of particular situation where he might be able to get you to try and put that fire out, put out that flame. But that's why in James 4:7, the Bible reads, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." And, you know, that's what Jesus did. When he was tempted by the devil, he resisted him. He used the word of God to rebut everything that the devil had to try and tempt him with. I mean, the devil tried, he offered him food, he offered him safety, he tried to entice him with power, you know, and Jesus just used the word of God to rebut everything. But be aware of that. If you're someone that's new in the faith, you're young in the faith, be on guard, because you're the kind of target the devil's really going to come after early on. So that was my third point, is resist the devil. Let's turn to Judges 15. Judges 15. But it came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid, and he said, I will go into my wife into the chamber, but her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I verily thought that thou hadst utterly hated her, therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. Now, just a little bit of background here, because I've skipped a bit of chapter 14 here for the sake of time. But Samson's wife had betrayed Samson. So Samson had this riddle for the Philistines, and there was, he'd made a deal with them whereby if they could answer the riddle correctly, that he would have to give them 30 sheets and 30 change of garments. But likewise, if they couldn't answer the riddle, then they had to give him the same. And so they went to his wife to try and get the answer to the riddle, and they threatened her life. So her life was threatened. She ends up divulging the answer to the riddle, and this infuriates Samson. And Samson goes out and kills 30 men because of it. And we're going to see here, sadly, the fate of his wife is no different. And we continue in verse 3. And Samson said concerning them, now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between two tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing cord with the vineyards and olives. He's not supposed to go near vineyards anyway, so it's probably a good thing that he burnt them all up, right? But here, what a scene. Like, could you imagine going out trying to catch 300 foxes? Just think about that. It doesn't mention that he had any assistance or help here. It just says, and Samson went and caught 300 foxes. That in itself I find amazing. But then imagine the scene. He's tying their tails together, and then he lights them up and lets them run off into the field. Wow. What a scene. Then in verse 6, then the Philistines said, who hath done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. How horrific. That's really sad. And this is a situation where I honestly believe, had his wife just done the right thing, trusted her husband, not given in to the Philistines' demands, she probably would have been fine. The Lord probably would have protected her. But in this situation, she's put her trust in the wrong people. She gave the Philistines the answer to the riddle. She didn't know that Samson was going to take revenge and, go kill 30 of these Philistines. She wasn't mission-minded like Samson was, and she wasn't on board with his mission. Right? So sadly, her fate's really, really dire. Now in verse 7, and Samson said unto them, though ye have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Etam. Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah and spread themselves in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why are ye come up against us? And they answered, to bind Samson are we come up, to do to him as he hath done to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the top of the rock Etam and said to Samson, knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this that thou hast done unto us? And he said unto them, as they did unto me, so have I done unto them. And they said unto him, we are come down to bind thee, that we may deliver thee into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear unto me that you will not fall upon me yourselves. And they spake unto him, saying, no, but we will bind thee fast and deliver thee into their hand, but surely we will not kill thee. And they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock. So here you have a situation where the men of Judah, they're not on board either. The wife was not on board. the men of Judah, they're not on board with what Samson's doing because he's stirring up trouble. By taking these actions and killing the Philistines and taking the battle to them, and this is his mission, he's stirring up a lot of trouble. And look, if this is going to happen for us, if you spend any amount of time soul winning and engaged in the battle, you are eventually, given enough time, you'll start stirring up trouble. People don't like it when you're doing the work of God. They hate it. They become critical because they often don't do it themselves. And so here you've got these men of Judah. They're not happy with what Samson's doing because they just want to be left alone. They don't want any trouble with the Philistines, And it's like a comparison today is like, and you've probably heard this, where some people will sometimes make this comment like, you're doing more harm for the cause of Christ. You preach too hard. You're causing trouble. Look at what these people are saying. Look at the trouble you're causing. The Sodomites are rallying outside the church. Whatever it might be, they come up with excuses, right? You're doing harm for the cause of Christ. In the eyes of these men of Judah, Samson was going to ruin their livelihoods, wasn't he? By doing this work for God, by trying to destroy the Philistines. That's why Samson was sent, to deliver them out of the hand of the Philistines. So they're not on board. And what you'll see throughout Judges with Samson, he's a bit of a lone ranger. There's no one really helping him. He's all on his own, but that doesn't stop him. He's not swayed either way, whether they be for him or against him. And notice here that he says to them, he specifically says, Samson said to them, swear unto me that you will not fall upon me yourselves. Now I think the reason he says this is not because he's scared of them. I think he knows through the power of the Lord he could just wipe them out. He doesn't want to hurt them. And for us, when we've got people that are critical of us, they're against us, they're railing on us falsely, whatever the situation may be, let's not get dragged into that. Let's not, try and fight fire with fire. Just leave them alone. Try and avoid that sort of conflict if you can. It's just unprofitable. It's not going to help you. That's a lesson that I've learned. It's just not worth it. Just let them be critical. Let them rail. Let them do whatever. Because who cares? If you're focused on the mission, it doesn't matter. And here Samson's focused on the mission. He doesn't care that they're not on... I mean, he probably does care. He'd probably prefer them to be on board. But the fact that they're not doesn't stop him. It doesn't stop him from being focused on the mission at hand. But he's also careful that they don't get harmed in the process. Caleb, would you mind getting a bit of water for me? Thanks, Caleb. Now in verse 14, and when he came unto Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand, and took it, and slew 1,000 men therewith. And Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jaw of an ass, have I slain 1,000 men. That's another amazing scene. Like we've had the foxes and the burning up of the vineyard, and here, could you picture watching a man taking the jawbone of an ass and slaying 1,000 men with it? He's on his own. There's nobody helping him. But it's by the Spirit of God. And the point I want to make here with Samson is I really believe this. I believe he was someone that always remembered the victories that he had with the Lord. So in these situations here where these men of Judah are not with him and he's on his own, I honestly think he's thinking back to the lion, and it's like the Spirit of the Lord came on me then and I slew that lion, and this is going to be the same situation here right now. I'm not concerned that the men of Judah are going to tie me up. I don't want to hurt them, so I'll let them tie me up. And then I'm in the hands of the Philistines. I'll just break loose and go nuts. And that's exactly what happened. And the Spirit of the Lord came on him and he slew 1,000 of them. And I think for us, the application is, let's not forget the victories that we've had with the Lord. Remember them. Remember the victories you've had. Try and even write things down. When the Lord's answered certain prayers, or you've been praying for maybe a relative to get saved, or whatever the victory might, and they end up getting saved, whatever the victory may be, try and remember them. Because the Lord's faithful, and in Samson's case, that's the point I want to make. Point number 4, Remember the spiritual victories that the Lord has given you. In Judges, now turn to chapter 16 of Judges. Actually, I want to make a contrast here before we go to Judges 16, and the contrast is this. And I think this is a good contrast. If you think of let's use the example of Samson and Jonah. Now, both of them have the Spirit of God in them. One of them is, Samson to me is somebody that's mission-minded despite his flaws, and he's ready to take on whatever opportunities are presented him in the situation and circumstances he's in. Whereas Jonah is the example of somebody that's given this commandment of the Lord to go to preach to Nineveh, and he's running away. He's not taking any responsibility at all. Now, Samson could easily get down in the dumps. His wife's just been burnt with fire. Like, he's had this horrible thing happen, and he's trying to do, in my opinion, the right thing by God. He's focused on the mission. It would be easy for him to sort of get bitter or get angry and just not carry on with the work of destroying the Philistines. He could just join those men of Judah and just live a safe, happy, peaceful sort of life. It's just not in his nature. This Nazarite that was dedicated from birth till death wasn't going to do that. And it should be the same for us. We're to live holy, separate lives. We should be dedicated to the Lord in the new man. So from our birth, which is the new birth, the spiritual birth, being born again, till the day we die, be dedicated to the Lord. Now, unfortunately for Samson, when we turn to Judges 16, I'll try and speed up here. Judges chapter 16, starting in verse 1. Then went Samson to Gaza and saw there an harlot and went in unto her. One Bible verse. That's it. That's all we're given here. But in that one moment, Samson has just committed such a wicked sin. Right. This is an incredibly wicked sin that he commits here. Now, it'd be wicked enough for just a regular believer, say a non-Nazarite, to commit this kind of sin. In this case, it's Samson the Nazarite. His whole life's supposed to be a dedication to the Lord. He's supposed to be separate, holy. And I believe this one sin here brought about a sequence of events that we're about to read here that ultimately ended in him ending his own life. So as we read on here, so fornication is a wicked sin, and look, serious sin has serious consequences, which we're about to see here. In verse 2, and it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson has come hither, and they compassed him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all the night, saying in the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. And Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city, and 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of a hill that is before Hebron. And it came to pass afterward that he loved a woman in the valley of the Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her, and said unto her, entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, and that we may bind him to afflict him, and we will give thee, every one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. And Delilah said to Samson, tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. Now, 1,100 pieces of silver is a lot of silver. That is a lot of money. And clearly it was enough to bribe Delilah here. Now, obviously in the first case, with his first wife, they didn't bribe her, they threatened her life. Now here they've used a different tactic for whatever reason. Maybe Delilah liked money. Maybe they knew what her weakness was, but they've managed to bribe her with this 1,100 pieces of silver. And then she goes about trying to convince Samson to give her the answer, right, to how he gets his power. You know, what does she have to do to Samson in order to weaken him so the Philistines can have their way with him? And what we'll do, I'm not going to read this whole thing. So there's a number of times where she asks Samson, he refuses to give her an answer 3 times. Or he doesn't refuse, he gives her a false answer. He tells her a fib on how he can be weakened, and then she carries out whatever it is that he says will weaken him, and of course it fails. And so she starts getting frustrated. She's like, why won't you tell me? And this is after 3 attempts. Samson refuses to tell her. But then eventually Samson caves. he gives up. He's just vexed and he's just sick of fighting. He's just sick of arguing with Delilah. And if we skip down to verse 17, and what's sort of sad about this is he knew. The fact that she tried to weaken him 3 times, he knows that she's going to betray him. She knows that he's going to be given into the hands of the Philistines. In verse 17, that he told her all his heart and said unto her, There hath not come a razor upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up unto her and brought money in their hand. And she made him sleep upon her knees, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. And she said, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as other times before and shake myself. And he wist not that the Lord was departed from him. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. What a sad state of affairs. Now look, we're told here that he lost his strength because his hair was cut. But honestly, I personally, this is just my opinion, I don't think his strength was linked to the hair. I think that was part of his vow and he shouldn't cut it. And he did the right thing. He had the long hair. He kept the long hair. If the Lord wanted to keep his spirit upon him and give him the power, he could have done it without the hair. And I think this comes back to his sin at the beginning of the chapter. I think really the Lord's departed from Samson here because serious sin has serious consequences. And that, and then he had his eyes gouged out to top it off. He's lost the power, he's lost the strength, and he's lost his eyesight. Now, I don't know about you, but it's bad enough being blind today in this modern day. Back then, I don't think they had guide dogs. I don't think they had anything to really assist you if you were blind. This is horrific, right? They've completely disabled Samson here by taking his eyes out. And let this be a warning, the sin of fornication is just that serious. That the Lord allowed Samson to have his eyes gouged out by the Philistines. And here's a man that was on the mission for God, and he, in just one act at the beginning of Judges 16, he messes his life up by going in unto a harlot. Completely messes his life up. And in Hebrews 12, verse 16, it reads, Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. For ye know how that afterward, when he would have inherited the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears. Now, I don't think this is about salvation here in Hebrews 12. What I think this is teaching here is you can cross a line with God where it's too late for him to forgive you. And I'm not talking about forgiveness to go to heaven and be saved. What I'm talking about here is in this life, you can cross a line where God says he's not going to change his mind. You've made your bed and now you can lie in it. Yeah. And Samson had made his bed here by sleeping with this harlot, and now he had to face the consequences. But look, there's a light at the end of the tunnel here. There's a silver lining here in this. And what we're going to see here is that at the end, Samson makes the most of this final opportunity that he does have. And if we continue reading, so even though God had, this is set in motion and nothing was going to change what was going to happen here, it didn't stop Samson from doing this final act. So let's read verse 22. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, Our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, Our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, Call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, Suffer me that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand, and of the other with his left. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords, and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. And this brings me to our final point here, point number 6, be faithful to the end. Now look, this is not the ending to Samson's life that I think the Lord would have desired of Samson. But that being said, he was faithful to the end. His final act, he's calling upon the Lord. Now I've heard a lot of people say, yeah, but he commits suicide here. Well, yeah, you've got to think about a man here that's had one wife killed in fire, the next one's just completely betrayed him, he's had his eyes gouged out. There's not much really going for Samson at this point, right? There really is not much going for him. If I'm honest with you, if I was in the same situation, I'd do the same thing. I don't think I'd want to continue in the flesh without 2 eyes in a time back then with all those Philistines still alive. No, I'm going to take them out. And that's what Samson does here in his final act. He's faithful to the end. He takes them out. It's the one last thing he could do. And I'll just read from 2 Timothy 4 verse 7. The Bible reads, I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. And this, ultimately, this brings me to my final point, which sort of sums up the whole sermon. And my final point, point number 7, is do not be an ornament on the shelf. Do not be an ornament on the shelf. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by this is when I look at the life of Samson, I see a flawed man, but he was no ornament on the shelf. Here's a man that despite his shortcomings, despite his failures, his weakness for women, he did the work of God. He carried out the work of God. His final act was slaying the remainder of the Philistines, 3,000, in that final act. And being the ornament on the shelf, you know, I think there's a lot of believers that make a big focus on trying to tick all the boxes, you know, trying to live that righteous life. Don't get me wrong, it's a good thing. Do it. Obey the commandments. But they're so busy trying to obey the commandments to try and look good, you know, that they just become an ornament on the shelf and they don't get involved in the rough and tumble, in the battles. They shy away from things that might seem too difficult. That's too hard for me. Somebody else can do that. I'm not going to do that. No. Get into the rough and tumble. Don't be afraid. Get engaged in the battle. Be like Samson. You know, let's look at the good qualities that Samson had and take that on board, right? There's obviously a lot of things that Samson could have done better in his life, but don't be that ornament on the shelf. And I'll just tie that back into Ephesians 2:10 again, and that is those works that the Lord has prepared for you, they don't just involve trying to live righteously. You ought to walk upright and trying to eradicate as much sin out of your life as you possibly can. But in the process, don't let that become so much of a focus that you forget to be engaged in all the other things that you ought to be doing to do these works for God. Because I think the biggest hindrance to people doing a great work for God is fear. And it's a fear of reprisals. It can be a fear of what other people are going to think, particularly in the workplace. Like, I've got my detractors in the workplace, believe me, because they all know, right? They all know what I believe. But, amen, let's pray.